Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second installment of Turning Point, our chance to collectively rediscover and reimagine New Brunswick on the other side of COVID-19. In some ways, we start this version of Turning Point with a heavy heart. I know all of you will individually address what's going on in the world through your organizations, but we would be remiss if we didn't take a moment to um, encourage those fighting against systemic racism, not only south of the border and in this country, but globally as well. We stand by you in that effort. We stand with you in that effort. And our thoughts are with you as we walk that road. Thank you for taking the time to be here. This is a really important discussion. As I said, this is the second installment of our series Turning Point, and we're discussing regional collaboration in New Brunswick. I know that's particularly relevant to a lot of us here. The facts are that we're 775,000 people in 74,000 square kilometers. Regional collaboration is going to be absolutely key to the future of our province going forward. And we have a great roster of speakers that are here with us today to introduce these topics, to discuss these topics, and to hear from you, the audience. For those who don't know me very quickly, I'm Matt George. I'm the founder of the Unsettled Media podcast network, and I will be your moderator for the duration of this series. Again, for those new to us, if you do miss the webinar, we are running this as a podcast series as well on the Growing Pains with David Campbell podcast. You'll find that on Apple, Spotify, Google, all of the places where you get your podcasts, and we'll ensure to link to all of those places as well. Before we go any further, again, I do want to address our partners who are making this happen. We got a great group of people on board: the New Brunswick Business Council, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Tech Impact, the New Brunswick Multicultural Council, the Chambers of Commerce in Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John, Conseil économique de Nouveau-Brunswick, the Atlantic Chamber of Commerce, the Pondish Pondé Center at the University of New Brunswick, and our partners at the Government of New Brunswick and ACOA as well. For a full list of presenting sponsors and speakers, head to turningpointnb.ca. So finally, before getting to introduce our speakers, I know we have a lot to cover. Just quickly, some ground rules to make sure this is a productive experience, especially for you. I'm a stand-in for you. I'm trying to get your questions to these experts. And with that, I encourage you to use the Q&A function within Zoom. We'll have a team member that's curating those questions and offering them up to me so we can get them to our speakers. If we do have a tech interruption, I encourage you to stay with us. I know there's a risk to doing something like this live, but it's very fruitful, and we know that the content is worth it. So stay with us. We'll do the best we can to make this as smooth as possible. I also wanted to very briefly introduce the framework for the discussion. It's pretty important. We're trying to envision change and innovation that comes after COVID-19, but we're also dealing with reality. We're digging back into the past of New Brunswick. Where do we stand right now? It's pretty important for us to frame the discussion in that way. Our committee's come up with a framework of 4 questions that we think frame the discussion quite well. Number 1 is, what is the pain that we're feeling in New Brunswick? Number 2 is, what is the cause of that pain? Number 3 is, how does that pain get better? So what actions can we take to make the pain better? And 4 is, how do we look confidently to the future? So what does that future state look like? So with that, I get to introduce our first speaker. Jean-Guy Finn taught political science and public administration at Université de Moncton before serving in several senior positions in the Canadian public sector. He became special advisor in the Canadian Privy Council office during the patriation of the Canadian Constitution. He went to the provincial government of New Brunswick in '83, where he served as Deputy Minister of Advanced Education and Training, Deputy Minister of Health and Community Services, and Secretary to Cabinet and Clerk of the Executive Council. He is currently a consultant in public sector management. Over the years, he has advised governments on public sector organization and management in Canada and abroad. He has been involved in public sector assignments in several countries, including South Africa, Qatar, Ethiopia, and Jordan. Wow, great bio, Jean-Guy. Appointed Commissioner on the Future of Local Governance in 2007, He is also the author of Building Stronger: Local Governments and Regions, an Action Plan for the Future of Local Governance in New Brunswick. Jean-Guy, welcome. We'll encourage you to take your mute off. We'll encourage you to share your screen and begin your presentation. And with that, the screen is yours. We'll get you to very quickly unmute Jean-Guy to make sure we can hear you clearly.
Here we are. There we go. Everybody hears me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
There you go, Jean-Guy. Perfect.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to make a few comments here in a short presentation, and this presentation is about the need to increase political and administrative integration in the province of New Brunswick. And we need to do this in order to better reflect socio-economic integration. We currently have at the ground level, we currently have a considerable degree of socio-economic integration. I mean by that, integration between and among local communities and local populations. But we have a rather fragmented political and administrative environment that doesn't reflect that socioeconomic integration. Our public decision-making and management mechanism are not geared to foster integration. And that's one of the key issues that we need to address if we are to get more regional collaboration and if we are to get people to work together better. At the local level, we have a number of fragmentation forces at play. And I'm just listing here what those factors are. The sheer number of decision-making centers. They exist by the hundreds: municipalities, local service districts, agencies, commissions. There's at least 350 LSD, local service district and municipalities, plus all these other agencies and commissions. So we're talking about probably close to 1,000 decision-making centers in the province. The size of a lot of these entities is an issue as well, because a majority of these governance entities are small in terms of population, territory, tax base. A number of them are configured around civil parish or local community. And property taxation policies are geared to local municipality and local service district. And in terms of service and infrastructure planning, that is done almost exclusively on a local community basis. We have an almost complete absence of regional plans as it relates to services and infrastructure. What have we got to counter these fragmentation forces? We have very little. In fact, there's only one formal common regional structure, and that is the Regional Service Commission that has been established a few years ago. And they are only responsible for a limited area or limited areas, 2 areas in fact, waste management and some aspect of planning. Beyond that one formal structure, there is a number of voluntary inter-community structures, but they are mostly single purpose. At the provincial level, we also have certain forces that are increasing, or at least are not containing fragmentation. You have the number of number of electoral districts, 49 now, but for a long time, since the 1960s, it was 58. The boundaries of these electoral districts, some of them coincide more or less with the local community. And the existence, of course, of the single member district. You will remember that before 1974, we had multi-member districts. We had 15 electoral ridings with multiple members elected in each of them, which was helping in terms of sharing on a regional basis. So all these factors put a premium on the local community, on parochial consideration, as opposed to regional interest. Also at the provincial level, you've got a set of administrative arrangements that are also not very helpful in terms of regional thinking. We've got an absence of common administrative districts or maps. You have as many administrative districts as there are departments of government or agencies of government. And even within the same department, you may have within the same department 2, 3, or 4 different districts, administrative districts. Administrative districts being geared to programs rather than the broader departmental mission. So all these factors also work against regional coordination and planning, and it tends to foster duplication. This fragmentation of decision-making is particularly obvious as it relates to public infrastructures and the way we go about planning public infrastructures. And this matters a lot in terms of how it relates to territorial development. I won't go into much detail here, but when we're talking public infrastructure, we're talking about the set of territorial installation that allows for the provision of public services and public goods. But it also plays a role in the delivery and the provision of private sector services and goods. And therefore, it's closely related to territorial development. I mean, these infrastructures, there's a large number of them, and they are different in nature. I mean, you have some surface infrastructures like roads and highways, railways. You have underground infrastructures like water and sewers, and you have air infrastructure like wireless communication and internet. But all of these have a bearing on territorial development. And the fact that federal, provincial, and municipal governments are involved in both the financing and the delivery of these infrastructures makes it difficult to bring about coordination and integration in the development of such infrastructure. it's probably best to distinguish infrastructure based on their nature, not in terms of how they involve the various levels of government. But if you distinguish the infrastructure in terms of their nature or purpose, then you would have sub-regional or local infrastructure like water and sewers. You would have regional or inter-community infrastructures like recreation and sports installation, schools, hospitals, and then you would have what I would call supra-region infrastructure like airports and highways. The last two categories, in my view, are the two that needs to be approached in a more regional basis as opposed to a more local basis in the future. And that's why, in my view, it's urgent to establish the regional territory as the principal common planning unit, both in terms of the provision of provincial services and infrastructure, and in terms of the provision of local services and infrastructure. So this notion of the common regional territory as the common planning unit is extremely important. So my point, I guess, is that we have to move from framing future development. We have to move from a focus on the local community to a focus on the regional aspect or regional community. We can strengthen territorial cohesiveness by aligning our public decision-making structures with the socio-economic and demographic conditions. And as I said at the outset, there's a much higher degree of integration on the socio-economic front than there is on the political administrative front. And we need in the future to configure services and infrastructure based on functional geographic areas, whether it's the municipality or whether it's the region. But we should focus our attention to these functional geographic entities. And in doing so, we have, of course, to recognize the complementarity between the urban, semi-urban, and rural zones within each of these governing entities. The management of the relationship between the urban, semi-urban, and rural zones will impact regional development and will impact the well-being of local communities. And we have to integrate much better economic, social, and environmental policies at the regional level. In other words, we have to build a stronger regional public service that would serve both the provincial government in its organization and delivery of services and local communities in their organization and delivery of services. So if we could build a stronger regional public service common to the province and to local communities, in my view, we would make great progress towards better coordinated development on a regional basis. We need to develop regional strategic plans on a multi-year basis. At this stage, we have almost no such regional strategic plans. When the regional service commissions were established, provisions were made for the development of such plans, but they never materialized, as far as I know. And finally, the last point is that we need to entrench in legislation what those services and those functions that must be shared on a regional basis. And this is not an entirely novel idea. Back in the 1960s, the Byrne Commission, which led to equal opportunity, had one recommendation that addressed this very issue. The Byrne Commission recommended that be created what he called metropolitan councils that were designed to provide for the sharing of a certain number of functions, and services among neighboring communities. That particular recommendation was not retained in the context of equal opportunity, but I suspect that if it had been retained, we would have experienced a different set of challenges than the one that we have experienced since the 1960s. So those are my short comments, and I welcome any suggestion or critique of those. Thank you.
Jean-Guy, thank you very much. We'll have you stop sharing your screen now, but we will bring you back for audience Q&A very shortly. So there you go. That's perfect. Okay, so we're going to introduce our first panelist. Dr. Herb Emery holds the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at the University of New Brunswick since July 2016. Herb is Program Chair for the J.D. Irving Roundtable on Manufacturing Competitiveness in New Brunswick and Director of the Atlantic Institute for Policy Research. He holds a master's and a doctorate in economics from the University of British Columbia. His academic career began at the University of Calgary, where from 1993 to 2016, he established a track record of excellence in research, teaching, and leadership. Dr. Emery's work incorporates political, historical, cultural, and other institutional factors that have shaped Canadian development processes, and I see that he is now skiing somewhere outside of Calgary. Dr. Emery, welcome to Turning Point. I invite you to give your opening remarks on regional collaboration and to reflect briefly on what you've heard from Jean-Guy before we go into Q&A and discussion. The screen is yours.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks, Jean-Guy, for a terrific presentation. I would like to just sort of make a few comments about this topic in a way that maybe it hasn't been discussed, and that's from the perspective of an economist's view of an optimal policy zone. And we've studied this in the context of merging provinces, redrawing provincial boundaries, and there's really three dimensions that need to be talked about, but in New Brunswick, we only talk about two. The first is that in a policy zone, there's a desire to have some kind of local decision making so that policies and decisions that are made reflect local interests as much as possible. So we would all like to have our preferred meal for dinner, but in a family, sometimes we have to choose one meal that isn't necessarily our favorite. The reason we do that is because the second dimension is that we have scale economies in providing public goods or providing infrastructure, and there's cost advantages of doing things over a larger population or on a larger scale. Now, typically what we find is that as you go over towards local preferences, you also get what we call higher transaction costs, that the costs of navigating all the decisions and harmonizing across all the different things people want to do raises the complexity and cost of getting things done. So if you're a business, it might be quite convoluted if you have to sort of you're working across the province and you have to deal with 100 different rules about how you're allowed to drive through a community and at what speed and things like that. So you might prefer a single policy over the whole region to reduce those transaction costs. The challenge we run into with this topic, and I think what's held this up in New Brunswick, is we typically talk about these two items, scale economies or cost efficiencies from doing one policy versus meeting what we prefer the most, which is our local policy or tailored preferences. And we view this as a zero-sum game, that if we go for cost efficiencies, I have to give something up, which is what I like. And if I go with what I like, I have to give up cost efficiencies and someone has to pay for it, which brings in the difficult thing under the equal opportunities world of New Brunswick, which is local preferences are enabled over efficiency considerations when you use unconditional grants from the center. So in other words, if you don't make voters pay the full tax price to reflect the full opportunity cost of the decisions they make, what you can wind up with is more diversification of policies, more fragmentation, because someone's paying for that isn't the local individual. So how do we get people thinking in terms of regional cooperation? We have to think about the third dimension to the optimal policy zone, which is growth of the regional economy, which is how do you get more people into your area, how do you get more business, and how do you raise your property values, which would come from investment and more population. This is a case where you now have to make an argument that either having unique local preferences fragmented over more areas makes for a more appealing situation for people and businesses to locate, or do you need to take a harder look at your region and say, if we could just harmonize, we would be able to attract more capital, more business. It's no longer zero sum. We would all win if we can agree internally what the sharing rule is. So if one community gets the heavy industry, let's say, how do we make sure that the appropriate tax divisions are going on? So one of the pieces that's been missing from this debate, and what I've been looking for, is for someone to give me a better sense, if we go through the political capital that we would need to burn to get more regional cooperation, what can we tell the public that would be involved? Where are they going to see the gains, and what is holding the region back now by not doing this? And so it shouldn't be just talked about in terms of cost advantages of providing local services, or to maybe have a better bid, or it could be infrastructure, you can bid better. But I think what we need to start moving towards is articulating the growth dividend of greater regional cooperation, and maybe having a harder discussion about the old ways of disguising the full resource cost of local preferences over scale economies by reconsidering some of those unconditional grants. And that might drive some of the innovation that I think you're looking for, Matt.
Thank you, Dr. Emery. We'll bring you back shortly for Q&A and for audience discussion as well. I'm now going to introduce our final panelist, Mayor Don Arnold. Mayor Don Arnold was elected in 2016 and brings a vision to move Moncton forward by building a stronger, more transparent, and economically sound city. She was first elected in 2012 as councillor at large and quickly earned the reputation of being one of Moncton's most active, involved, and accessible councillors. In her mandate as mayor, Dawn, in collaboration with council, will see through the responsible completion of several key projects. Dawn is a recipient of the Order of New Brunswick, the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, the YWCA's Women of Distinction Award, and most recently 2 Paul Harris Fellowships. Mayor Dawn Arnold, thank you so much for being with us on Turning Point. I'd like to invite you now to give your opening statements on regional collaboration and some reflection on what we've heard from Jean-Guy and Dr. Emery. The screen is yours.
Great, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Jean-Guy and Herb. That was really set things up really well. I'm obviously a big proponent for this concept of strong regional hubs. Strong cities make strong provinces, and I believe city building is nation building. But what we have right now is not sustainable. But how do we change this? Because we know that 85% of New Brunswickers live within 50 kilometers of New Brunswick's urban centers. And yet there is not a level playing field for all New Brunswickers when it comes to paying for access to the infrastructure and services that are used. So we need to, in my opinion, strengthen our urban centers to strengthen our entire province. Because our cities are our economic engines. We need to continue to grow and flourish, despite the fact that cities right now only receive 8% of the taxes paid by New Brunswickers. Our urban centers need fair compensation for the services that we provide. So we need to come together to implement key changes to New Brunswick's tax system, because we need a fair property tax system. Because the concept that citizens pay for the services that they use is a fundamental cornerstone of our democratic society. Our city dwellers are consistently and constantly subsidizing our neighbors in outlying areas. The costs not being paid by taxes in our unincorporated areas are $100 million a year. And New Brunswick is literally the only province in Canada where the province retains part of the property tax revenue. So the average property tax rate is $1.51 in all of our urban centers. And the average LSD is 63 cents. So this is just not sustainable. We will continue to urbanize. Our province has changed radically over the last 50 years, but our political system has not changed to reflect this. And I loved what Jean-Guy was talking about. I won't personally comment on our provincial political system, though. So today, New Brunswick collects $360 million in property taxes. Only $66 million is returned in unconditional grants to the municipality. So approximately, again, $100 million is used to provide services and infrastructure in LSDs and unincorporated areas. The remaining $190 million goes to general revenue for the province. So if municipalities were permitted to keep their own property taxes, we would have more than enough to deliver on programming and services. And we need to come together to create these economic regional hubs to attract growth and opportunity and provide more cost-effective and efficient services to all New Brunswickers. But we need to receive our fair share for the infrastructure and services that we provide so that our cities can pump to their maximum capacity to lead the growth and support all of New Brunswick. If our cities are performing well, this will benefit the rural economy as well. It's a classic hub and spoke model. All of us need New Brunswick to be successful, and New Brunswick can't be successful without our cities. I believe that there's enormous opportunity to get this right in New Brunswick right now, because we have so much to offer. I think the opportunities are amazing. So I was asked to ask a question that all New Brunswickers should be asking themselves, and this is my question to you. Why do we have so many municipal politicians? Toronto has a population of 2.7 million people and has 26 elected officials. If we were to use this same rationality, meaning that each elected official represented 108,000 people, our entire province would only need 7 people. So obviously this is not probably ever going to happen, but do we really need 637 municipal elected officials, which does not even take into consideration? I had 237 local service districts, but Jean-Guy said 350, and they don't even have elected representation. So obviously this is not sustainable. It does not provide good governance, and it certainly doesn't allow for really good decision making. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Mayor Arnold, thank you so much for your opening remarks. I'd like to ask you to stay with us. We're going to welcome back Jean-Guy and Dr. Emery to have a more broad panel discussion. And I'd like to get the audience involved right away. We have to address, at least for a moment, the elephant in the room, which is COVID-19. And an audience member, Guy, asks, the model Jean-Guy is proposing is ideal, but how do we collaborate better right now, given the situation we find ourselves in with COVID-19? And Mayor Arnold will stay with you, and then we'll go to Dr. Emery for quick reflection on the situation we're in now with COVID-19.
Well, actually, I've been amazed by the level of collaboration and cooperation. Like we talk with this for sure. The 8 cities talk all the time, but the 3 cities, St. John, Fredericton, Moncton, we're in constant collaboration. Should we open our parks or our climbing structures? Like we're talking all the time on issues. And here in the Moncton Riverview Dieppe area, we have really great cooperation. So things are happening, but the pandemic has actually increased collaboration.
Mm-hmm. We heard from the Premier in episode 1 of Turning Point that there was a similar scenario between the provinces and Ottawa, where actually communication channels are now more open than ever. Dr. Emery, can you reflect on very briefly on where we find ourselves in regards to COVID-19, and then we'll go to Jean-Guy.
Well, I think the urgency to figure out a solution to this collaboration regionally has just increased, because if you're looking ahead and looking at history, what we're about to see with governments at senior levels burning through their cash pretty quickly in borrowing room is they're going to start cutting some of the unconditional grants to lower levels of government. Mm-hmm. And so if you think that today is sustainable with what you have to start looking ahead and say, what can you afford if you start to lose some of those unconditional grants? And this is going to force the thinking towards the reduced administrative costs, the greater efficiencies coming in. And if you're not ahead of it proactively and voluntarily, you run the risk that it'll be imposed on you. You might just lose some facilities. You can't pay for them. And so you're going to have to negotiate your way into someone else's if it's recreation. So my warning would be from the 1990s, when we did a lot of this work on helping municipalities fix their finances, it came from the dynamic of the feds offloading debt onto provinces, offloading debt on or obligations onto municipalities. And that's what I'm expecting to see in at least a year's time from the post-pandemic era.
Mm-hmm. Jean-Guy, is the path to collaboration, given COVID-19, even more obvious? Is the door even more open, or do we still have challenges in front of us? And we'll ensure that you unmute yourself so we can hear you clearly. You should be able to unmute at the bottom
For
of your, there
sure,
you go, Jean-Guy.
for sure, this COVID-19 has made us, by necessity, to cooperate and to collaborate. But this just shows what kind of an effort it takes, given the structures that we have put in place for the last 50 years. It shows how much effort it requires in order to accomplish such cooperation and collaboration. And it would be much easier if we were structured in such a way that the planning of a lot of our services and our infrastructure was done differently than the way it's being done in the last several decades. And I agree with Dr. Emery that I mean, the COVID-19 and what it has involved in terms of public spending may force us to make decisions now around these issues that we thought we could keep postponing. We have postponed those decisions for at least 25 years now, and perhaps, I'm not sure yet, perhaps the COVID-19 will force us to make certain of these crucial decisions around how we're structured and how we govern ourselves, both at the local level and at the provincial level.
I can tell from audience engagement that a lot of the questions have to do with speed and how do we do this now given the circumstances. A good take on the pandemic that I've heard is it doesn't change the future so much as it accelerates the future. We know what we have to do, and this is forcing us to get down to business and do it. But if we know what we have to do, what's the biggest challenge in this space? Is there one overarching challenge that you'd point to where we've come up against a roadblock time and again in regional collaboration? And Jean-Guy, I'd like to stay with you and then go to Dr. Emery.
Well, COVID-19 has showed us how the political parties in the legislature, present in the legislature, can cooperate on a specific issue. I believe that if there was an attempt at this particular time, if there was an attempt to propose a comprehensive set of reform to our governance, that this may be a window of opportunity where opposition political parties, all of them, would join forces with government to accomplish or to achieve these changes. Mm-hmm. Remains to be seen, but there is, I think, if this plan is well articulated, that it would be difficult for any of the opposition parties to oppose it in a systematic way. You would have to have good reasons to do so. And it may not be that popular to do so at this point.
Dr. Emery, if you had a magic wand, what's one roadblock you'd get out of the way quickly in pursuit of regional collaboration?
I really think I would go back and look more seriously at the unconditional grants and shielding people from the full tax price of the decisions that they're pushing for. It's hard to have a cooperative solution when no one's really forced to address the pain that they're putting on society with their decisions or what they're indulging in without having to pay for it. So it's hard to get across to people, but if you don't have to face the full tax price of those services that you want provided, it's just too easy to let things drift and not fix things. And so I think that it's a problem for the region generally. The dependence on transfers federally is another thing that masks any kind of provincial regional cooperation with other jurisdictions. COVID has created a condition that we've had to cooperate or collaborate, but if you really want the incentives to do it, you have to pull away some of that safety net or allowance that allows you to carry on as we are. And to me, what's unique about New Brunswick is the unconditional grants that are really used to discourage innovation and collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Mayor Arnold, did you have a quick reflection on a challenge that we might be facing in regards to regional collaboration? Is there an 80-20 here somewhere?
Well, I mean, I agree with both speakers, but I think it's our political system is a big barrier to us implementing some real and meaningful change to make our province sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we do have representation from another mayor in the audience. We have the mayor of St. John, Don Darling, with us. And Don asks, could you ask Mr. Finn what political courage is critical to implement the policy changes discussed today and in your 2008 report, Jean-Guy? And this says a lot about Mayor Arnold's comments as well.
Well, it's the courage that is needed is the courage to put forward a plan and articulate it and tell the people why it's needed and what the benefit of it would be. Mm-hmm. And this is what is missing. What we have been doing is going at this on a piecemeal basis. So people cannot see what the benefit would be. For example, if you just take Dr. Emery's idea and address the grant issue, unconditional grant issue, without telling people how this relates to other issues in how we are governed, people will not understand what this means and they will oppose it. There has to be a comprehensive plan put forward and a politician in place, whether it's this government or another one, have to have the courage to put that comprehensive plan in front of people and show them what the benefit would be long term and why we cannot continue doing what we're doing the way we're doing it. That has happened in the 1960s when equal opportunity was brought forward. It was opposed to start with. It was opposed by various interest groups, but in the end, it prevailed because the government of the day said, this is what is needed. This is how it's going to work and this is how it's going to benefit to you people. And we've got to get this same kind of pedagogy or teaching on the part of the government of the day on these issues.
I'm assuming there have been many plans put in place prior to now. Is what you're saying, is the problem the communication of these proposals and how it affects real people on the ground in real time?
Yes, and it's explaining to people how the various parts, the various components of these changes will work together to their benefit in the longer term. Whether it's in planning infrastructures for the future, whether it's planning the delivery of services for the future, whether it's in terms of taxation of properties for the future, all of that has to be integrated, put together, and explained to the general public. And the people have to be able to see what the benefits are. I mean, I'll take just one example. The example of the attempt to make changes to the emergency room in rural hospitals back in the winter. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was announced one day in isolation of everything else, okay, in the system. So people that live in those communities could not see why these changes were to be made. Why would you make that? And what's the benefit to us of these changes? And unless those changes can be put in the context and part of a broader plan that will work to replace what was perceived as being taken away, then people will not accept it. And that's what has happened, and government backed off. But if government is going to try to do that again, I think they have to put this in perspective and put this as part of a broader plan to
Thank you,
help.
Jean-Guy. Thank you very much. The audience has a lot of questions as well about the urban-rural divide, which we've heard much about. And Dr. Emery, I've loved your framework around this. You're framing that. How do we rediscover that question and frame it more as a win for the entire region? And our listener Gaston asks that exact same thing. How do we improve the discussion around the urban and rural divide? And we'll go to you, Dr. Emery, for that.
So again, the urban-rural divide is an interesting one to think about because there's a lot of, it's a bit artificial in one sense that a lot of people in rural areas are commuting to work in urban. So if we took Mayor Arnold's insight that what we're really looking at is we have a hub, you want to think about some kind of regional governance that takes account of the fact that your hinterland for labor supply isn't just in the downtown core, it moves further out. And from there, as a narrow-minded economist, I just think it comes down to you can make a choice of wherever you want to live in that hinterland, but I think you should recognize that not all services can be provided at the same level at all points, and that in return, that may affect how much you pay in tax in order to live there. So what we miss is that when we promise everyone that you can choose to live wherever you want and get the same thing as anywhere else, that we just can't do that. And what we've seen in other provinces is a decision to be clearer about the limitations on what we can provide and tie it much more to the location that you're offered to live in. So if you make a choice to live rural, you're not under attack if you have lower services. You understand that that's part of the bargain. If you want to have access to the full service hospitals, you'll move closer to the larger urban centers. So again, you have a lot of entitlements built into New Brunswick that people have it, and now we're asking them with collaboration. They perceive it as they're being asked to give something up. But my concern coming out of COVID is it's not going to be a choice to give it up. It's going to be forced onto the province anyway. So this is why you need to have more of a discussion now and manage the change that's about to come, because for 10 years, New Brunswick has fought change after the 2008 financial crisis. And now you've kind of run out of gas to keep that change from coming. So Jean-Guy's discussion is quite apt because this is the time to be talking about what does the New Brunswick look like.
Right, right. Thank you, Dr. Emery. And Mayor Arnold, I saw you nodding there. Do you have some further comments for Gaston in how we improve the discussion around urban and rural?
Well, I really like what Dr. Emery has said, you know, like the idea, we need us all. I mean, it's not one is better than the other, one's different than the other, but it's managing expectations too, you know, like we talk a lot about the cost of sprawl, like being able to even, you know, get a city to work, you know, you need a certain amount of a density for that to work. And we think, you know, that the narrative has always been, well, I'm just going to live a little bit beyond here and I only have to pay a fraction of the taxes. So how do we, I guess, how do we reframe that narrative to Dr. Emery's point? And I think we have to do it. It's not sustainable what we have right now.
Right, right. We have some really great questions coming in. I like these takes. Cameron asks, if we all agree that regional collaboration is needed, what's preventing our governing bodies and stakeholders from achieving this? And maybe the way I'd like to frame this, because we do want to talk about solutions, we don't want to just talk about problems. Similar to my question on, is there an 80-20 in regards to challenges? Is that also true of innovations? Is there some low-hanging fruit that we can walk towards really quickly to walk this road? I might give an example before we go to you, Jean-Guy, about what innovation we could introduce, but the old example of one regional airport. We know there are differing opinions on what that would look like, but that's an example of innovation of regional collaboration. Can you give us an example of something that would be innovative in this space, Jean-Guy, that we could do in the near future?
Well, I mean, in terms of healthcare, for example, we mentioned that earlier. I mean, there's no doubt there is potential using technology to tremendously improve the quality and level of primary care offered in remote areas of the province. And and do it in such a fashion. If you take a regional approach to that, doing it in such a fashion that those improved primary care services are complementary to what exists in the larger centers, and how they would help each other. I mean, the technology would help bring these services to the rural communities, but also it would connect the rural communities with the larger centers in terms of secondary and tertiary services through technology. I mean, that's an opportunity that exists now that didn't exist 25 years ago or 20 years ago.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a concrete example. But again, if you're going to do that, you will have to think in terms of the region and how each of these complement each other. If you do that in isolation of what exists in the urban, more populated areas, then you haven't accomplished a whole lot. It has to be done in a complementary fashion on a regional basis. It's a hub. It's the hub. I mean, presented in a different perspective. In this case, is the hub in terms of healthcare, but it works the same way as the hub in terms of economic development.
Thank you, Jean-Guy. Dr. Emery, how can we take one step down this road in the near future? What's an 80-20 on innovation that we can look at?
Well, if I knew that, I'd make a lot of money as a consultant. But again, I would go back to taking a closer look at the existing incentive structures to collaborate. So when we've tried to do it voluntarily, there's no cost to someone walking away from the table. And what we really need is more of an incentive structure in place, like either a positive one, like we will give infrastructure to the first region that comes in with a plan that fits for a regional growth agenda, or we will not be providing infrastructure on a regional level from the province to an area that doesn't show an ability to do this kind of collaboration. To get this bargaining going, I think going away from the politics of leadership, but into governing at the level of province to create the incentives to get the communities that you're hoping to bring together with regional cooperation. What incentive structures do you have around the big spends? And you can use punishments like I talked about, like threatening unconditional grants. You can use carrots, like we're willing to do broadband to a region who can come forward with a regional plan for coordinating on healthcare services. But starting to think big about how we get a better society, as opposed to my tax rate's lower than your tax rate, we've got to harmonize. So back to Jean-Guy's point is you need a bigger vision for this. And you need a structure in place where the province wants to use its powers to direct collaborative decision-making in a direction that would be positive. And that's not coming in with a hammer and just telling people you must do it. It's almost more of nudges that you're going to introduce through your financing of arrangements and your willingness to finance infrastructure and other activities that way. That's where I would look.
Mayor Arnold, the interesting thing about innovation, maybe the underrated thing about innovation, is it can be quite simple. It's great to get creative, but it can also be going back to the drawing board and back to the basics. Is there something that you're doing in your office in Moncton, or something you're thinking about more broadly for the region that we can do to be innovative here in terms of collaboration post-COVID-19?
Well, I think we're doing it right now. Look at how we're using technology. Like I am the chairman of our pension board, and often, we can't get the actuarials in from Halifax during a snowstorm. Well, we had a pension board meeting the other day. It was fantastic on, Zoom or WebEx or whatever. I think the pandemic has forced us to come together in new and innovative ways through technology. But I really agree with this idea of incentivizing collaboration. I think that is smart. I think it's a lot harder politically than theoretically it sounds really good, Dr. Emery, but boy, that's really, really tough work. And you have to have political gonads like I've never seen before to make that kind of thing happen. So I'd love it, but boy, that's really tough. It's really tough. Those are tough conversations to have.
Sure. Yeah. Dr. Emery, I want to come back to you for one final audience question before I ask for your final comments. And to the audience who didn't have their questions asked or answered, I should say, we will be transporting those over to the podcast as well. So stay tuned for that. You mentioned broadband, Dr. Emery. Heather asks, how will regional collaboration address the socioeconomic challenges of citizens in New Brunswick? And they mentioned poverty / lack of broadband access. Maybe just quickly 1 minute on that.
Well, even more quick to start, to Mayor Arnold's point, I've never been elected to anything, so I am coming in with an academic perspective. In terms of the socioeconomic detriment, neglects of infrastructure, or things like rural broadband, a regional plan might actually offer you more opportunity to get that, because if you think about, you're going to build ahead. So if you think your urban hinterland's going to sprawl, or you're going to have a new industrial park, you can get a lot of this built in just by having a cooperative structure that is thinking beyond just the immediate local needs. With poverty, again, what we have to think about is, it's not necessarily, it shouldn't be the local government tasked with those responsibilities. That should be moving up to the province, if not the feds. That's the universal basic income ideas, the better education system. So to me, that's just a case where we could actually ask the provincial government and federal governments to look at why we load so many of these responsibilities for poverty alleviation onto local government, which is not as easily set up to deal with those things. And you can go to the City of Toronto and they will tell you they can handle most of their business, but not the stuff that's been loaded onto them by the province for homelessness, poverty, and other social challenges that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's a case where we should be talking about a provincial level strategy and paying for it at the level of province, not dumping it on the municipalities to figure out in the voluntary sector.
Hallelujah.
Jean-Guy, I want to come to you for one final, very quick ending sentiment before we wrap up today.
Well, I think the trick here in New Brunswick is to preserve the key principle of equal opportunity while moving in such a direction that we adjust to the changes that have taken place in society since that particular program was put in place. Like the shift in demographics, for example, that the mayor talked about earlier. I mean, whether we like it or not, it has taken place and it will continue taking place. So how do we adjust the structures that were put in place in the 1960s, preserving the key principle of equal opportunity, and therefore bringing equity in terms of services around the province, at the same time as we are making adjustment to reflect these changes that have taken place in demographics, in economic development, in technology development, and so on and so forth. And if we can come out with a plan that marries these two dimensions, I think we might be on a way to something that people will understand is needed.
Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much, Jean-Guy Finn, Mayor Don Arnold of Moncton, and Dr. Herb Emery. Thank you all for contributing to the discussion, for submitting your questions. And like I said, we will bring those questions over to the podcast as well. We're going to be back this coming Thursday, same time, for the New Brunswick economy. And we're going to be hearing from Herb Emery again, and Kathy Simpson and Louise Como as well. Please do register for that third installment of Turning Point. And thank you very much for being with us today. See you next time.